This is Making Better Decisions. I'm your host, Ryan Sullivan. Decisions are where rubber meets the road for organizations. Each week, we'll be learning from people who are on the front lines of turning raw data into better outcomes for their organizations. This show is sponsored by Canopy Analytic, helping companies make better decisions using data. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Making Better Decisions podcast. Today's guest got his undergrad in civil engineering, then received both his master's in civil engineering and his PhD in computing and systems from North Carolina State University. He did some research before transitioning into modeling catastrophic risks. His career has mainly focused on the software and insurance industries, working for the Department of Energy, AIR Worldwide, and AIG. Please welcome Vice President of Actuarial and Analytics at NFP, Sashi Tadinada. Welcome to the show, Sashi.
Thank you, Ryan. Happy to be here. Very excited.
I am also super excited. I have obviously a handful of questions, but I want to start you off the way that we start everybody. What is one thing you wish more people knew about using data to make better decisions?
One of the most important things I feel in the world of data analytics and making decisions using data is the importance of feedback from the real world. I spend my entire time modeling the real world in some way, trying to predict something. And the main important thing for me always is how useful is it? As as many times we all know, most models are wrong, but some models are useful, right? So to me, that's a very important aspect to get feedback from data and to iterate quickly. That's always something I try to focus on, try to always hone my process over is make a model or create a solution, get feedback. What does the client think? Does it help him make a decision in a more clear way? And that's always been a guiding light for me, a beacon, if you will.
Yeah, I think that, as is the case with really any very technical discipline, there is, I would say, a bit of a lack of full understanding as far as what is actually going on. And so I think that a lot of people, in order to make use of a lot of these tools and technologies and things like that, they use heuristics. They, take mental shortcuts in order to better understand things. And so when somebody hears, "Oh, well, I built a model that is a forecaster, talks about the future, talks about any of these things," they're like, "Oh, so it's magic, right? You predict the future." Right. And then if any portion of that ends up wrong or anything like that, it's like, "Oh, well, you don't work. None of this works. This stuff's made up." And it's like, okay, well, I think there's probably a middle ground between magic fortune telling and worthlessness.
Yeah. And that's exactly where the iteration comes in. Iteration comes from sometimes it's feedback from the client or whoever is your stakeholder that you're servicing. Sometimes it's the actual outcomes in the real world. It depends on the phenomena you're trying to model and what you're trying to forecast. And there are two examples in my world where we help client plan their risk for their company or their entity, right? And many times, so that means that they have to buy insurance in some way. Or so one of the way we can help is to say, look, this is the kind of limits you want to look at. This is what can happen to you realistically, and this is the way, right? That's based on the models. We come up with a situation that is kind of extreme, but not all the way to the extreme, right? And another way is to actually get data. Ultimately, you see you see these outcomes. You look at how many accidents are happening for your company or how many claims are happening, and then that gives feedback. So It's both ways, actually, that helps us guide the model, build better solutions too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the other things, and obviously I don't want to go way far into the weeds of like math and stats and all that stuff for a lot of the listeners who are bracing here. So don't worry, we won't go too far into the weeds. But I think one of the big things that folks are unaware of is that most models produce a distribution of likelihoods for different outcomes. So I'm going to take that out of statistical talk and I'm going to explain what that means for anybody who might be listening that doesn't understand. So, yeah, take for example, I think one of like the great examples of this was a few election cycles ago. Nate Silver, who runs the website 538, generated this model that called the presidential election in all 50 states completely accurately. And this had never been done. Everybody got super excited about it. He was using a different type of statistical modeling that some people had poo-pooed and all this stuff. But what a lot of folks didn't realize is they're like, oh, well, he called them all right. And it's like, okay, well, that's kind of a distillation. What he actually said is that there's like a 55% likelihood of this happening and a 45% likelihood of this happening. What is meant by a distribution of outcomes versus just a binary yes no?
So again, to your Nate Silver or election prediction point of view. So you want to predict the party. Let's say there are only two parties for simplicity, and in every state, it's either Republicans or Democrats. And so what Nate Silver does, or anybody in that, is he is a poll aggregator. He takes polls from all kinds of sources, media organizations, phone polls, and so on, and puts them through a statistical model which would which would say there's 64% chance that Republicans will win a state X and 36% that Democrats would win that, right? And he did that for all the 50 states. And essentially, to be confident of your prediction, he would probably put a cutoff like 60%. If the probability is 60%, oh, I'm calling the state Republican or I'm calling the state Democrat. And that's what he's done incredibly well that year, especially. And let's go back. What does it mean by probability? It means that if this election happens, let's say 10,000 times, 60% probability is 6,000 times Republicans are winning it and 4,000 times Democrats are winning it. And that's what he does. He just generates thousands of scenarios. I think he's probably generating millions of scenarios where the whole poll are what is called simulated many, many, many times. And why do they have to simulate? It's because they're not asking everyone in the state. They're really asking only a few people. Like in this county, there are 1,000 people here and a poll of 2,500 somewhere else. So with aggregating all this information, they try to predict what if all the eligible voters would do and so on.
How can we help decision makers within an organization who are trying to consume analytics, they're trying to consume things that come out of these advanced statistical models,
Yeah.
but they may not have a fundamental understanding that the results coming out of those models are probabilistic. So, how do we help them digest that so that they can make the right decisions without thinking that it's all about magic or that it is, worthless?
A simple way to think about it is that there are always a range of outcomes, right? So there's a best case situation, there's a worst case situation, and probably a most likely situation. We're three simple buckets, right? And what what these analytics try to tell us is, first of all, what's the probability of your most likely situation? It's not always 50%, and it's not. And what's the worst case situation? It's probably the real bad situation that we don't want it to happen is probably happening 2% of the time. And what's the really great outcome? Again, that may not happen all the time, right? It may be 5% chance that the best outcome happens. And when you buy a stock and it becomes like 10 times higher or something like that, right? Yeah, that sort of thing. And so these analytics, when they give these probabilities, they give us a sense of, they give us a kind of a measuring stick in some way to say how much risk do I want to take? And that's a math in to put it in a layman's term, how do I avoid the real worst outcomes? Right? Even if there is a 2% chance, but there is no way I'm going to take that risk, right? You want to maybe figure out a way to plan that contingency beforehand. And same, and so in terms of course, the best thing happens, we are always ready and we want to accept it. There is nothing to plan there. But I think in terms of making decisions, you want to avoid the adverse outcomes. And these probabilities help us in some risk, take a risk adjusted decision.
Yeah, no, I think that that makes sense. I think you've brought up the topic of these kind of like super horrific events, right? We talked about it like I was laughing, right? Catastrophic risk when I was doing the introduction. So I know that there's a lot of thinking around this stuff. People wrote quite a bit about it. I think, one of the most famous books, at least in the circles that I run in, was Nassim Taleb's Black Swan. Um, Talk to me. First off, let's start at the beginning. Teach me what catastrophic event means.
So, catastrophic event means that these are rare events that happen, and the outcome of these rare events is generally very, very bad. In it, it can be economic, it can be cost to life, whatnot, right? So these are typically, we all hear about these natural disasters, that 9.0 earthquake that hit Japan, in 2011, or we talk about this hypothetical earthquakes or massive hurricanes that happen. So these are not happening every day, thankfully,
Yeah.
and but they happen rare enough, and the economic consequences and consequences to life and property and in every way to society are generally very, very high, very, very bad. Could be the stock market crash, that we saw in 2008 and so on. And they're all, that is what Nassim Taleb calls them black swan events. And very famously, he says that these events, just because they're rare, doesn't mean eventually they will happen at some frequency, but that probability is very hard to predict. So that's his entire thesis, the way I understand it at least, is precisely that. It's tough to predict these events, so you need to plan for it. You need to be anti-fragile. That's his big word, and I love that. You need to be anti-fragile to plan for that really bad day, and then rest of the business can go in.
I agree with, I think, your summarization there, and also that to me is kind of the valuable takeaway. I think this is, this is rock solid business advice, right? So okay, don't have a horrific debt to equity ratio. Don't over leverage yourself into things, right? Like,
Right.
looking at the big financial crisis, right? There's, first off, I think any statistician would be uh well, actually, I should call myself a mathematician. I was pure math, not applied. So I guess I'm a little bit of a poser talking about statistics, but covariance is a thing, right? It matters. But also, just like if our entire financial market had not been drastically over leveraged with debt, then it would not have had as drastic of an impact as it did. So sure, there was, problems in the housing market, but if we didn't have, massive leverage amounts throughout the entire financial industry, we wouldn't have seen this global collapse that happened. Now, aside from the idea of being anti-fragile, which I want to circle back to, there's still this concept of an event that has a really, really, really large consequence and a really, really, really small probability. And human beings are notoriously horrific at understanding things which are really big and really small. In fact, I would argue that we are really bad at understanding that there's, like you talk about a standard test, like a test in America, like a in high school or college or whatever, where he scored out of 100, and some kid asks the professor, like, hey, if you give me point 0.1 points here, I move up a letter grade. It's a big help. Would you help me out? Can I write you a paper? Can I do something? And there was a teacher that famously would talk about the statistical significance level of the point 0.1 point that they were giving, right? So human beings are like, okay, well, a 94.9 and a 95 don't seem that different. It's like, well, they're different, So talk to me a little bit about what do we use to handle these types of really big events, really small probabilities, because our brains just aren't it.
You hit a great point there. That's the whole work of Dr. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winning with the prospect theory, and he studied extensively how we overestimate the importance of low probability events and how we underestimate the importance of the high probability dangers, like traffic. His famous example is that traffic accidents are more likely to kill you than airplane crashes or terrorist attacks. But in our image, that we blow these probabilities out of proportion and we drive unsafe and whatnot, right? uh and that's exactly. And I don't know if there are any quick fixes to appreciating these probabilities, right, or anything, but it certainly, that's where slowing things down and looking at these probabilities realistically, I think with practice, uh, will will help us understand the risks better and understand the consequences in a more refined manner.
So, again, I don't want to go way far into the statistical weeds, but I think a concept that's super valuable to have as we talk about this stuff is kind of the idea of like an expected value, or whether, some people might call this a weighted average or whatever. But so let's say that there's a 50% chance of me, I get a lottery ticket, right? And this is a very, very favorable lottery ticket, right? So there's a 50% chance that I win $10,000 and there's a 50% chance that I win nothing. So the expected value of that is $5,000. Right now, obviously, what did I pay for the ticket? All of these other things go in there, but there's this idea of taking the probability and multiplying it times the outcome and adding it up to get this expected value. So when we talk about these really, really, really big penalties for a catastrophic event, and we multiply that times a really, really, really small probability of it happening, it literally multiplies the problem of people not understanding either number. And so you end up kind of in this weird space. And there's obviously statistics that can help us understand this. But when we transition thinking about some of these problems from a statistics standpoint to a business standpoint, preparing for like the expected value of one of these black swan events many times is not financially advantageous.
That's absolutely a fantastic point you're making here. Many times we all always think of averages, right? And even in marketing material, it's always okay. This investment gives you an average of this return, or this, you buy this product and you get this, average of whatever, average of improvement in certain metric. And that misses a big point, especially when you're dealing with in the world I am in. When if you're an insurance company and you just say, "Oh, you know what? There's only a 0.001% of a category 5 hurricane happening. Okay, it's $10 billion loss and whatnot, and the average just comes out to 1 million or something, and it happens." And it's very dangerous to just think in averages. Averages are great only when you have a large amount of data and they kind of follow in a symmetric or a simple distribution. In extreme events, they're famously what is called skewed or fat tail distribution. That's, again, I don't want to go into too much math, but essentially what means is that the probability of that extreme event might be zero, but the consequence is not zero. And by looking at just the average and planning for the average day, you're going to you're going to be in you're going to be in a little bit of danger there, when black swan events happen.
Yeah. And I think that this, as we kind of take this a little bit more full circle to incorporate more of the conversation, we had talked a little bit about how, okay, how can we help organizations and particularly decision makers and leaders within those organizations to understand the outputs of some of these models and understand like what some of the use cases are. Yeah, I think the point that you made really hits home for me, which is that a lot of these modeling techniques, they function, I was going to say best, but somewhere in between best and exclusively, like not quite exclusively, but like around the mean. So, like, if you imagine one distribution, which is kind of the one people are familiar with, this bell curve distribution, it functions really, really well. And it describes the population really, really well as you get closer and closer to the center of it. But as you get further and further out towards the sides, these are literally called outliers. When we start getting one, two, three standard deviations away from the mean, the distribution just kind of doesn't describe because there's not enough meat on the bones out there. So for a business leader, like you kind of the insurance industry has just great examples. You're like, oh, well, there's this tiny chance of a category 5 hurricane just like coming in and destroying all of these major ports. But it's like if that happens, it's so bad that we just can't let it happen. Right? It doesn't matter that the probability is low. We have to prepare for it no matter the cost. Right?
Exactly. Yep. That's the first principle of risk management. You make sure that you prepare for the worst and hope for the best, right? And it's as simple as that. And actuarial sciences actually teach a lot about this in some way, and they have a wealth of techniques that they have honed over the years. So even if you want to do something like just mathematically speaking, many times if you want to plan, let's say you want to store money for a certain thing, or you want to price a risk, there's a mean cost for you. And what you do is some kind of a weighted average of this mean cost and some kind of a weighted average of an extreme cost. And this is what is called, in our world, we call it PML, which is probable maximum loss. So this means that we take the a weighted average of, let's say, your average loss or average cost for a particular business program is going to be $1,000, right? But in the in the adverse outcome situation, it's around I don't know, $25,000. So you take some kind of a weighted average to plan in some way of this thousand and the 25,000. So how do you get to that 25,000? Is they correspond to a very low probability. So usually, if you can imagine, so the average loss is happens, in average time, right? And then there's a loss that you probably heard in the context of natural disaster. You hear what is called a 1 in 500 year, or a 1 in 100 year, or a 1 in 10 years flood, and so on. What is 1 in 10? 1 in 10 is nothing but there's a 10% chance that that flood happens in any year, or this flood can happen 1 in 10 years, or one in similarly, you can think about what's a consequence or a loss or a cost that I can incur 1 in 100 year, or the 1% chance that that can happen. And you usually take this average number and this 1 in 100 as an example, an extremely low probability but high loss, and you take the average loss and you put them together and maybe combine them in some way to that is called risk adjusted planning in some way.
I think one of the big takeaways that I'm getting is when we think about less about, the insurance side, which obviously as a math nerd, I find very interesting. There was a time and period where I was, possibly going down the actuarial path. Um, but I think for business leaders that are making decisions, sometimes many times outside of the insurance industry, every business has risks. Every business has some catastrophic risks, right? Like it depends a little on the definition, right? Not everybody deals in category 5 hurricanes, but there's something for every business that we don't want to happen, right? Every single one of your clients just up and leaves all on the same day, right? Okay, bad. So at least in my mind, and I think this circles back to Nassim Talib's advice, businesses should think about what are the things that we absolutely can't tolerate and just build a business that is as immune as possible to those things. Right? Because the math just kind of doesn't help us. Our our ability to understand these large and small numbers really gets in the way. So we have to think about these super rare but very, very painful events. What can we do to make sure that they just don't happen and use math for the rest? Or am I missing a piece of the puzzle?
No, I think you summarized it very well. So there's a cost, right, to saying, oh, this bad thing cannot happen, but it might be extremely expensive. You want to still be realistic about, and that's where the models help us. The models are generally wrong in some way. Maybe they're not super accurate, uh, but they point to a direction saying, uh, okay, this bad thing I wanted to avoid, what is the probability of that happening? And maybe even if the model is off by an order, it's still helpful to have the model than not have it at all. Because in that case, going back to your point, we blow up these probabilities in our head. Maybe we are putting too much danger to it, or too much emphasis on it, or too less emphasis on it. So the models certainly help in kind of pointing to some way. And also there's a cost involved in avoiding that, right? In some way you want to transfer that risk, you want to buy insurance, or you want to make sure that you put it in a contract that, hey, you know what, we won't do this or X or Y, etc. And there's a cost of it. You might lose business because of that, not attending to it, and so on. So the models certainly help. So in kind of gauging what the limits of our tolerance of that risk is, and then the rest of the analytics flow after that.
Sashi, I could continue talking to you for the next 4 or 5 hours about the statistics involved in this stuff. I nerd out on it, which is funny because when I was back in undergrad doing math, I was super duper focused on the pure side of things. I didn't really enjoy applied math, and now it's some of the more exciting stuff to me because you get to see it in the real world. I have a little bit more experience with that, so it's really fun getting to take some of those skills and apply them to the real world. And even though it doesn't work, try to predict the future. But I'm curious, outside of thinking about all of this stuff, tell us a little bit about yourself outside of work. Help us get to know you.
So I play tennis for a hobby. That's my favorite thing to do. I try to work out as much as possible. Play tennis. I've picked up the game like not I haven't played it as a kid, but I
Yeah,
picked up recently. I've fallen in love with it. So anytime summertime, I'm looking forward to the weather warming up a little bit, and I'm looking forward to get back to court again. That's what I do.
I love it. Yeah. My wife is actually huge into tennis, and depending on the day, or if the weather's nice or whatever, she's like, "Hey, come play tennis with me." And I'm like, "All right, well, I guess this is going to be a confidence match for her because she's just so much better than me." She wipes the court with me. But it's one of those things where, like, I see the appeal of it because it's this really fun blend of brain strategy, but also like the physical athleticism and the precision to kind of back that up. Like, you're really kind of playing this active chess match, across the net, which is really fun.
Chess match, and it's risk management too.
Yeah.
I can't help nerd out on that, but as they say, right, defense wins championships. So you don't want to hit that great looking shot that's great for the highlight reel, but if you try it all the full match, and you're gonna lose it.
Yeah.
So I've been on that side many many times, and
Well, I lose either way. She's just way better than me. I can't really keep up.
yeah, yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, it's definitely a fun way to get out there and enjoy some good weather and to stay
Yeah,
healthy.
yeah.
So, if anybody liked what you had to say, wants to learn a little bit more, connect with you, anything like that, what are the best ways to reach out?
The best way is to reach out to me on my email or LinkedIn. My email is shashikant.tadinada@gmail.com.
All right. Absolutely. I love it. Sashi, as I mentioned before, I could talk to you about this stuff all day. I just had so much fun getting to like dig into the weeds with you and also like apply a lot of these ideas to areas that I haven't before. So I can't thank you enough for coming on and spending some time with me today. This was such an awesome experience. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Ryan. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of it and to have a very lively conversation on this. Yeah.
Absolutely. I also want to make sure to thank all of our listeners, especially if you've made it all the way to the end of the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you did and you liked it, please tell a friend, give us a review, hopefully a good one, a like, a subscribe. All these things make a huge difference in keeping the podcast going. Sashi, thank you again so much for coming on. And this has been another exciting episode of the Making Better Decisions podcast. That's a wrap for today's episode of Making Better Decisions. For show notes and more, visit makingbetterdecisions.live. A special thank you to our sponsor, Canopy Analytic. Canopy Analytic is a boutique consultancy focused on business intelligence and data engineering. They help companies make better decisions using data. For more information, visit canopyanalytic.com. There's a better way. Let's find it together and make better decisions. Thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you next week. Peace.